From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. On the other side of Congress, Senate negotiators have been working to build support for a deal that would continue funding for aid to Ukraine, as well as policy changes potentially to help rein in the chaos at the southern border. And Kate, interesting turn of events here last week in that President Trump came out and suggested that he might not support any deal on the border. Here is what he said in a post on Truth Social. I do not think we should do a border deal at all unless we get everything, in all caps, needed to shut down the invasion, also in all caps, of millions and millions of people, many from parts unknown into our once great but soon to be great again country. He added, I have no doubt that our wonderful Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, will only make a deal that is perfect on the border, unquote. And Kate, I think this is interesting in that it is sort of a parallel to the conversation we are having in the House about spending, which is when you control only half of Congress, you can get a deal that is good, that has modest gains, that has wins, and you can claim it as wins. You can go back to voters and say, this is what we accomplished and this is what we achieved, even though it's not everything. But in a divided Congress, it is really hard to get any deal that is quote unquote perfect.
Yeah, even if you run the table, I'm not sure you get a deal that is perfect, given there's some internal division on immigration, even in the party. So yes, it's an absurd standard that's not realistic. I think I'd add two things to that. One is that we've been writing that I think it's not necessarily in Trump's political interest to scuttle a deal. And now he thinks maybe that he wants to campaign on it. He doesn't want the border to be in better shape. Maybe bloody-minded there's some political interest in the border being chaos. But as we've been writing, I mean, if Congress were to pass some of these changes, for instance, on asylum law, on third country standards, on folks who pass through another country on their way to the United States, these would give even a future President Trump real tools to handle the immigration crisis, even if President Biden elects not to do that. So I think it's a mistake on his part. Even if he were to come back to office, this would be helpful to him to have a change in law. But also, I think congressional Republicans should be very cautious about taking his political advice, given Trump's record at the ballot box recently in congressional races. I mean, Republicans do not have a lot else to tout on the trail at this point about what they've been able to accomplish. And the headline stories have been about throwing out their speakers, about fighting over appropriations bills. I think it could be useful to have something to show. Even if they don't get a, quote, perfect deal, they would have something to point to that would really make a difference at the border if it passed. So I think they should be really wary of accepting Trump's advice that there's no point in a border deal now.
Kim, what's your read of this? This tweet to me looks like Trump is preparing to torpedo this deal. And part of it might be what Kate lays out, which is that he sees a political advantage in continuing chaos at the border. But do you suppose that there are enough Republicans in the House and the Senate who are independent-minded enough to say this deal is good for the border and it would be good for President Trump if he wins re-election in 2024? And so I'm going to vote for it, even though he is whipping votes against it.
We'll see how that goes. He has proven incredibly influential in past congressional debates. I think this is still a jump ball in terms of where he comes down, and here's why. Speaker Mike Johnson has clearly been working very hard to keep Donald Trump on side. And I don't suggest that his recent endorsement of Donald Trump was entirely aimed at sort of trying to smooth his way in these debates and others, but it certainly was a decision that the speaker felt hopefully would help him. And so I think what you're seeing, and this was interesting, Donald Trump came out the other day, and he obviously, as you said, Kyle, said if they don't get everything they want, then they shouldn't do this deal. But he also said, I have no doubt that our wonderful Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, will only make a deal that is perfect on the border. So we'll see if Mike Johnson can keep him there. That is going to be the warring impulse in Trump, is one part of him, and certainly his advisors are going to say, this is an excellent campaign issue. Biden is hurting so long as the border is a mess. But, Trump occasionally does have spurts of loyalty to people, and we'll see at this point how much ability Mike Johnson has to try to keep him close, to try to sell him on any deal that comes from the Senate if it's good enough. Look, at the moment, what this does serve to do is put more pressure on Senate Republicans to get a tougher deal, knowing that there isn't going to be an easy reception in the House. And it keeps pressure on Mike Johnson who went to the White House recently for a conversation with Biden to try to get as tough a deal as he can. I'm still not entirely certain Trump is going to torpedo it. If he does, I do think, given its election year, it could be very difficult to get an adequate number of Republicans to go along that Mike Johnson feels that he can do it. Remember, while he did buck his House Freedom Caucus on this top line spending deal and also this recent decision to kick the spending bill's deadline further, there's only going to be so many times in reality that he can go to Democrats again and again and pass what you could call majority Democratic bills. So I think we're going to have to watch this situation closely.
A fair point from Kim. Trump has never been a paragon of political or policy consistency. And so maybe this Truth Social post where he's suggesting he will come out against a border deal will prove to be a false start, and that he will support Mike Johnson and the Republican Senate in passing whatever comes from these negotiations. But Kate, I think part of why this is an important opportunity is that we're in an interesting political moment, in that to get any sort of legislation like this through the Senate, regardless of which party is in control, regardless of which party is in the White House, you need 60 votes to clear that Senate filibuster threshold. And right now, you have an opportunity to do that because Democrats, some of whom are skeptical of border enforcement, know that President Biden is in a situation where this is the number one issue on a lot of voters' minds, and it will be going into November. So there's an opportunity to bring along enough Democratic votes to get over that 60 vote threshold right now, because they are trying to save their incumbent president. And if we got to a point where, let's say, President Trump wins re-election in 2024, I think a lot of those votes would up and vanish. And even if that same package of border changes were offered in 2025, let's say, I think it would be much harder to get over the filibuster threshold, because many of those Democrats would revert to oppositional mode and not wanting to anger the progressives in their flanks who don't want anything done about the border.
Right. I think that you're right that there may be a narrow opening here to get something done, and that Washington will not be less inflamed if Donald Trump returns to office. But also, I think that does go back to another point, too, which is that does Trump want to be able to do something about the border when he does arrive in Washington, if he were to win again? I think that bears directly on whether the putative deal would be worth doing. But on the other hand, to Kim's point, I think he may be leaving some options open, and that you do have to evaluate this deal as it comes. I mean, this deal has been in limbo for some time now, before Christmas even, and there was an agreement to make progress on talks after Christmas. Well, one of the sticking issues has been parole, a way by which the Biden administration has just waved in hundreds of thousands of people into the country. I think any deal would have to get progress on parole to be palatable, both in the Senate and to have even a chance in the House, given that still wouldn't be everything that the House wants as defined by their own bill, H.R. 2. So you also need a deal that has some real substantive changes, both on asylum and in parole, I think, for it to have any chance of getting through either house. But I do think that is still, I mean, the other element we haven't talked about here is Ukraine. And President Biden wants the money for Ukraine, but so do some Republicans. And that is an area that might counsel getting a deal sooner rather than later, because while that battlefield has been relatively stagnant, both the Russians and the Ukrainians are trying to break through. And so there is a risk, the longer these negotiations go on, that there's a real change in the battlefield in Ukraine that makes the politics of the deal different in Washington as well. So I think that's another factor that lawmakers should consider as they're evaluating how to strike a deal that would suggest it would be worth doing quickly.
Hang tight. We'll be right back after one more break. Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Let's close with a letter from a listener responding to our recent podcast on electric vehicles. This is Brian in Tucson, Arizona. He says, as a 3-year Tesla owner who has taken 1,200-mile road trips without any problem, whose only maintenance aside from tires is windshield washer fluid, and whose monthly electric charging cost was $13 before installing solar panels and driving for free instead of $150 for fuel, I would like to offer my humble prediction. And it is this, Kim. He says that he thinks in 2034, range anxiety will be this. if we take the old internal combustion engine car, will we be able to find a gas station between here and Nevada? And Kim, I can imagine a world in which that kind of range anxiety exists. Although, given the number of legacy gas cars that are still on the roads, the proportion of car sales, even right now, that are still gas-powered internal combustion engine cars, if I had to take the over-under on 2034, I think I'd take the over.
Yeah. You know, one thing I actually really love about the entire internal combustion and gasoline-powered industry is it's privately owned and it's organic. And so you get gas stations that appear in places where people really need gas. And if it turns out they don't really need gas because it's a wonderful, thriving private market, they go away. Not something that is remotely the case as we talk about the entire government planned industrial policy machinery that is now exploding around the erection of charging stations for EVs around the country. And if there's one thing I know from all of my time watching Washington is that if you put government in control of these things, they will screw it up phenomenally. So, Kyle, I would not only bet that there would be gas stations around for internal combustion cars, but I would wager that we'll still have major problems for those who are driving EVs finding their stations to charge up as well, too. And, you know, none of this might be the situation if this were something that were occurring organically. If we had a situation in which people like our reader, who, by the way, I salute him. I think it's great he's got a Tesla. I think it's great he's got one that doesn't need a lot of repairs. That's not always the case for a lot of electric vehicles. I think it's great that he's got the time to look and see where the charging stations are and do all those trips because he wants to do that. That's fabulous. Go ahead and do it. And if more people choose they want to do it, then maybe some charging stations will pop up to make that process easier if we had a free market. But the question is, are you going to force me to do it too? And, you know, for some people, a lot of people, there is, we know for a fact, a greater expense. There is at the moment, as the Energy Secretary found out on a road trip last fall, a lack of adequate charging stations. And it's still a bit of a hassle for a lot of people, one that I'm not sure government is going to fix.
Thank you, Kim and Kate. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.